Hello and welcome to today's video. Today, I'm going to be talking about all of the different gut healing diets. I'm going to break down what they are, how they work, and how to decide what might be the right choice for you. I've had the opportunity to work with thousands of different people and I've been through my own gut health journey. And one of the things that every single person, myself included, has in common is trying a whole bunch of different diets. I'm going to be providing valuable insights on several different gut healing diets. We're going to be going from GAPS to specific carbohydrate to low FODMAP, gluten-free, dairy-free, Candida, Weston A price, food sensitivities like histamine, oxalates, and even a look at plant-based. So wherever it is, whatever you've got going on, whatever you're trying to do, this video is going to have some very valuable insights for you. So let's start at the top of the list in no particular order. We're going to start with sensitivity elimination diets. So what I mean by this is any diet where we're specifically avoiding a certain category of food due to sensitivity. So in this category, I'd put like low histamine diet, low oxalate diet, low salicylate diet, basically any diet where we're trying to remove foods from the diet that contain a certain molecule that we have some level of sensitivity to. So the best and most appropriate way to do this is if you do have a true or genuine sensitivity to a certain molecule in food. Let's take histamine, for example. Avoiding histamines in the short term is really beneficial. If you've lost the machinery that you need to break down histamine correctly and your body is being overloaded with histamine, it's going to create a lot of chemical imbalance. This is going to disrupt the functions of your immune system, of your digestion, and just being in a chronically overloaded state of histamine surplus is going to feel horrible for you because you're going to have a lot of uncomfortable symptoms. But whatever it is that you might be sensitive to, histamines or oxalates or salicylates, sulfur, thials, anything, it's really important that you understand that this is not a long-term solution. Just eating a low salicylate diet isn't going to heal salicylate intolerance. So whilst I'm all for these kinds of diets and having had histamine intolerance myself, knowing how much relief it brought me using a low histamine diet, if you are struggling with any of these molecules, definitely avoid them in the foods that you're consuming. But just know that it's not a long-term solution and you need to do something else to address the actual root cause of that dysfunction. Another important thing to consider when you're looking at sensitivity elimination diets is that if you don't actually have a sensitivity to a food group, there is no point in avoiding it. I see a lot of people doing low oxalate diets, even though they have absolutely zero problem with metabolizing oxalates. They have no kidney stones. They have no problems. They have absolutely zero symptoms from consuming them whatsoever. This means that your body is strong. It means your body is healthy. It means it can process and metabolize oxalates. And there's literally zero benefit from removing them from your diet. The same is true for all other plant chemicals, salicylates, also things like histamine. If you don't actually have a sensitivity to it, there is zero benefit. And actually you're making your life much more difficult because having one type of food sensitivity, if you're sensitive to histamine, you're going to lose like 60% of foods. If you're sensitive to oxalate, you're also going to lose about 60% of foods. But if you combine them together, you've now lost like nearly 90% of all of the foods that you could possibly eat. So it's really important not to overly restrict yourself. The next gut health diet that we're going to look at is the low FODMAP diet. I'm following the sensitivity elimination diet with this one because it's very similar. Using a low FODMAP diet is very much a symptom relief diet. FODMAPs are categorized as being foods that are higher in fermentable fibers. This means that there's a higher likelihood of fermentation. So if you're somebody that's dealing with digestive problems and there's an element of dysbiosis, especially in the small intestine, so you'd be thinking more like the SIBO, SIFO, any type of upper GI issue, having a larger amount of fermented foods in your diet can make your symptoms significantly worse. But again, it's really important to emphasize doing a low FODMAP diet is not actually healing this problem. This is symptom management. In fact, using a low FODMAP diet in the long run actually has negative influences on your health. FODMAPs are essentially fermentable fibers. These are what is really important to feed your microbiome in the long run. FODMAPs are the best food for improving microbial diversity, especially in the colon. And one of the things that you'll see is using a low FODMAP diet for an extended period of time, you'll start to see a decrease in the beneficial organisms in the colon. And you'll also see a decrease in the postbiotic substances that these organisms produce, especially things like B complex vitamins, butyrate, and other things that are really important for health. If you are going to use a low FODMAP diet, first of all, don't plan on using it for the rest of your life because it isn't actually solving any problems. It's just giving you temporary symptom relief. Secondly, FODMAPs are quite a broad category of foods. And I've worked with dozens of people that are using a low FODMAP diet and they're eliminating all FODMAPs when they're actually only sensitive to certain groups of those FODMAPs. For example, if you know that you respond very badly to, say, onions and garlic, which are considered high FODMAP, but you seem to tolerate broccoli and cauliflower very well, which are also high FODMAP, they're a different FODMAP. It doesn't make sense to eliminate the broccoli and cauliflower. Continue to consume those foods. Keep them in the diet. Don't just broadly remove all of the foods because they fit in the FODMAP category. As I said, we're using the low FODMAP diet for symptom relief, so avoid avoid the things that give you the symptoms. If you have other FODMAPs that you can eat that are healthful for you and they don't give you any bloating or discomfort or extra symptoms, there are actually significant benefits from continuing to consume those foods. So make sure you personalize that diet a little bit so that it works better for you. The next gut health diet we're going to look at is the specific carbohydrate diet. This is a really interesting concept, and I'm going to explain to you how this concept works and why this can help people with healing their digestive problems. So the catchphrase of the specific carbohydrate diet is breaking the vicious cycle. So if we look at what this vicious cycle is, it's going to really help us understand how the specific carbohydrate diet works and how it provides a healing outcome. So the biggest and most fundamental concept of the specific carbohydrate diet is that we're only consuming specific types of carbohydrates, specifically monosaccharide sugars. So we're trying to avoid disaccharide sugars and starches. Starches are big chains of sugars. Now, the reason we're doing this is when the gut lining is damaged, we lose the ability to break down and digest carbohydrates correctly. The final stage of starch and disaccharide sugar digestion is with brush border enzymes. So these are enzymes that are present on the lining of the small intestine. I'm sure you've probably seen an Activia advert or Yakult or something like that. And you see inside the gut all of these like wiggly little protrusions that are moving in the digestive system. On the lining of these little microvilli, you have hundreds and thousands of different enzymes. You have things like DAO, which help you break down histamine. You also have things like maltase, which help you break down starch. And if your gut is damaged, you lose the ability to produce these enzymes, and consequently, you can't digest these foods anymore. And because you can't digest them, something dysbiotic, pathogenic, potentially Candida or sibo or some kind of organism will move in to break this down for you. The problem, though, is that as this organism moves in and starts to eat these sugars that you can't digest, it produces harmful substances, things like acetate and aldehydes, lipopolysaccharides and endotoxin. There's a big list of different things that dysbiotic organisms can produce. And these things not only intoxicate you and create all of the problems associated with leaky gut, like autoimmune problems, arthritis, anxiety, depression, that whole enormous list of different leaky gut problems, but it also damages that gut lining and prevents you from being able to produce these brush border enzymes that you need to break down these foods correctly. And this is the vicious cycle. You eat food that you can't digest, which feeds pathogens. Pathogens produce toxins that damage your gut lining and prevent you from being able to digest your food, and then you're stuck in a loop. So if this is what is happening in your situation, this diet is actually solutions orientated. And by that, I mean we're actually addressing a dysfunction. Instead of just trying to avoid symptoms, we're actually trying to fix a problem. However, I personally don't recommend the specific carbohydrate diet for one reason. And this reason is that there is a better diet that is built upon this. It has a lot more work put into it, a lot more research, and it's been a lot more elaborated on. It's almost like the specific carbohydrate diet 2.0. And if you think you know what this diet is, leave me a comment and let me know. Because if you know, you'll know. But this is the diet we're going to talk about next. So now we move on to the GAPS diet. This is the Gut and Psychology Syndrome diet by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. This is a diet that heavily builds on the principles of the specific carbohydrate diet, but has some additional layers. This is a diet that I do highly recommend. The best way to get started on this diet, if you have any interest, is to buy the little yellow book called the GAPS book. You can literally just go on Amazon, type GAPS, Gut and Psychology Syndrome, look for the little yellow book. I must have read it like 10 times. I've read that book a lot. It's a really, really good book. So the GAPS diet is building on the philosophy of the specific carbohydrate diet. So everything I said about the specific carbohydrate diet in the last section is true for the GAPS diet, but then we have some extra layers. So in the GAPS diet, there's more of an active role in trying to actively heal the gut and influence the microflora composition. Probiotics and fermented foods are a very big part of the diet. There are also heavy reliance on nourishing animal foods, especially nose to tail eating. So things like meat stocks, and in the later stages, bone broth, organ meats, even fermented animal products like kefir. I'd say probably of everything on this list, GAPS probably would be top of my list of diets that I think have a good potential for gut healing. The only people I would be hesitant to use this with, and this would be true for any diet where you have any kind of restriction whatsoever, is if you have any history with disordered eating of any kind. So if this is anorexia, bulimia, if this is ARFID, if you have any kind of history with restrictive eating, any of these diets could be potentially hazardous for you. But GAPS tends to be pretty heavy on the fat and quite low on the carbs. There are still carbohydrates, so things like honey and fresh fruit and juices. There are still some options, but what you're going to see as we go through this video is some of these diets combine well together. So for example, when I started, I I did a low histamine GAPS diet, which is really tricky because a lot of the healing foods on the GAPS diet are high in histamine, but I couldn't tolerate histamine. So combining these two together, I made a bit more of a personalized diet for me that worked really well. But GAPS can be quite restrictive because you're really trying to eat clean. There's a big emphasis on clean eating, so avoiding any types of like toxins or toxicity in the food. It's not perfectionist, you know, you do the best that you can with what you've got. You don't have to eat 100% organic. And I do really like that is emphasized, because just saying if you don't eat organic, you're never going to heal is such a defeatist attitude. And it's also not true. So there is an emphasis on cleaner eating, but also I find that if you're struggling with digesting fat or protein for any reason, and there's a lot you can do to support that, but if you do struggle with those things and your body weight is really low and you really are quite dependent on carbohydrates, something like rice or potatoes or something like that. And I know what it's like if you're stuck on a diet of like 6 foods and you're really stuck and you're like, well, I want to do the GAPS diet, but 3 of my foods are starches. I'm going to be down to 3 foods. It can be really tricky. And especially if your body weight is really low, you're already struggling to eat enough, it can be complex. There are some ways to work around it, but also for some individuals, I wouldn't recommend it. As with all diets, it really is a case by case basis. But overall, solid diet, I really like it. Next, we have the paleo diet. So the principle of the paleo diet is to try to mimic eating what we would have eaten in the Paleolithic era. So you're going to see a reduction in the kind of grains that you're going to be eating. You're not really going to have so much potatoes. It's mostly going to be leaning towards, let's just eat like a lot of meat. You know, the kind of idea is that in the Paleolithic era, we would run around and hunt mammoths. We would kill a mammoth. You'd eat a whole bunch of meat and fat. And then maybe you'd be able to find like 5 berries or like a handful of nuts or like a little tiny little tuber, like almost like a potato, but not very starchy, much more fibrous. And the principle of the diet is literally just, we believe we ancestrally would have eaten hundreds of thousands of years ago. And honestly, I can't really fault it. It's a pretty solid diet. Again, it is quite restrictive, especially if you live in the modern world. Watching on a YouTube video, you probably live in the modern world. You know, if you go to a birthday party or if you're going out to eat dinner, you know, you can't have like seed oils. You're not going to be able to eat any refined sugar. You're basically going to be stuck just eating fish. And if that fish is farmed, then probably that's not really great for you either. So again, it's one of those diets that tends to be on that more restrictive side. If you just like live in the middle of nowhere and you just eat at home, great, no problem for you. But if you have a social life, a bit more difficult. And then we have the next level to this. The next gut healing diet is the autoimmune paleo diet. So this is taking the principles of the paleo diet, enhancing them just a little bit further to look at some of these foods that might have been potentially a little bit more inflammatory and removing those. So this is in essence the paleo diet, and in its already fairly restrictive state, but we're also going to cut out all of the grains. We're going to cut out all of the nuts. We're going to cut out probably dairy as well. So you end up really being left with non-starchy vegetables, meat, fish, maybe eggs. I think some people also don't do eggs because they can be potentially inflammatory for some people. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So you're going to see there's actually quite a lot of crossover with some of these diets, as in paleo, autoimmune paleo, GAPS. There's some common themes here. The next gut healing diet is a little bit of a curveball, a bit different. This is the elemental diet. So the elemental diet is used when you are experiencing usually it's used for either SIBO or like an upper GI dysbiosis, or when the digestive system is extremely inflamed and you have an extremely inflammatory condition like Crohn's or colitis or something like this. So usually this is used when you're at the point of like fairly severe malnourishment, or you're pairing it with some kind of antibiotic, antimicrobial therapy to try to alter the composition of the microbiome. Now, overall, in my experience, I'm not a huge fan of this because generally the way that it's done is you're taking some kind of almost like a parapharmaceutical, extremely highly refined processed food and using it to replace your average foods that you would be consuming. A better option would be to try to break down and pre-digest the food that you're eating as much as you can, which again is sort of what you're doing a little bit on the GAPS diet. You know, there's a heavy emphasis on the soups and stews and things that have been cooked a long time and smoothies and things like that. But it is possible to create your own elemental formula at home. I've done this with a good handful of my clients that are really struggling to get enough nourishment from their food. And you can use this almost elemental smoothie milkshake kind of thing, either as a complete replacement because it's fully nutritionally complete. It's everything that you need to have in your diet, or you can use it to supplement the food that you're already eating so that we can increase the overall food intake. But the goal of using it, the goal of the elemental diet generally is take food and break it down into its elemental form so that it doesn't require any digestion whatsoever. So again, you're going to see that you're kind of doing the same thing with the GAPS diet. You're trying to achieve the same thing, which is the premise of GAPS gaps and the specific carbohydrate diets are that you have this vicious cycle. And then the elemental diet, in a way, is trying to break that cycle just through a different angle. In that, if we provide food that is 100% pre-digested, it gives the digestive system a bit of a break, and maybe it can heal enough in the 10 to 15 days that we do it, so that when we start to reintroduce food, the digestive machinery is stronger and it's more able to break down and digest the food correctly. And as a consequence, we've broken that cycle. So it's a very interesting diet. The context is very important when you're looking at using it, but it definitely can help. I'm just not overall a big fan of the parapharmaceutical preparations where they're basically just like a hyper processed food. I'd instead try to do it by pre-digesting foods naturally. As in, make some vegetable juice, combine that with some honey, or if you really need it, like some dextrose powder, get some essential amino acids and a protein powder that has been all broken down to its individual amino acids. Mix all of this together, add some fat if you're tolerating fat, like a coconut oil or something. Very, very easy to digest. And if you do this and you're doing it in a natural way, if you look at the ingredients of an elemental formula, this is basically all they do. But they do it in an extremely highly refined way. They usually have like artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, a whole bunch of vegetable oils, which can be very inflammatory, and doing it yourself just gives you a little bit more control. Next on the list, we have the carnivore diet. So I've done a carnivore diet video. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't. But if you want me to go into an elaborated amount of detail, you should definitely go and check it out. But for now, what can I say about it? It is overall the top of the list for elimination diets. You're basically removing everything. Just about anything that you could possibly have a reaction to, you've avoided it. On the carnivore diet, you have no oxalates, you have no salicylates, you have no starches that need to be digested. And in a way, what you'll tend to do is monomeal. So you're basically just putting one type of food in your body at one time, which means your body can focus on breaking down and digesting that individual food. There's a principle known as food combining. And the theory behind this is that different foods compete with and inhibit or complement and support the digestion of other foods. One of the most common is that proteins and meats, like animal products, inhibit the digestion of starches, starchy carbohydrates like potatoes and rice. And I would say that there is some pretty decent truth to this, because if you look at a lot of these diets, what they're doing in a way is removing food groups that compete and creating the diet plan that is more supportive of digesting the foods that we're eating. The carnivore diet is kind of like the maximum extreme level of doing that. Carnivore diet can be really nice if you have autoimmune problems, if you have severe leaky gut, if you're reacting to just about everything and you can't figure it out, you have no stability, your life is just like this crazy 24/7 reaction. But overall, unless you absolutely need to use it, I would discourage you from doing it. First of all, it is kind of new. I know that you have like the Inuit, and there are like a few, like 2 or 3 people here and there that have just been eating meat for like their whole life. But overall, it's not very common to see carnivores. I'm a huge fan of meat-based diets, but there are so many benefits to consuming other foods other than meat if you can consume them and tolerate them. The positive influences on your microbiome, the enhancement to your immune system and to your antioxidant systems, and also the improvements in like the taste and the enjoyment that comes with eating food. I know that if I'm going to have a steak, I love to have some salt and pepper and, you know, maybe some like butter garlic sauce or something. It makes it so much better. So it is one of these niche use diets. I think that it's growing in popularity because so many people have digestive problems right now. And for a lot of people, it does provide significant relief. However, again, it's not a long-term solution. It is not fixing a problem. You're just avoiding it. You're controlling it. You're managing it in the same way that you would be with one of these sensitivity elimination diets. I'll also say one of the things that's really tricky about carnivore is I see a lot of people that have a limited diet of maybe 20 to 15 foods. And they hear about the carnivore diet and they think, well, I'm already quite restricted as it is. What do I have to lose? I'm just going to go carnivore. They go carnivore. They try it for 2 months. They see very small changes, maybe a 5 or 10% improvement. But then what happens is that 5 to 10% improvement begins to go away. They come back to baseline. They go back to where they were. And then if they try to add any of those 15 to 20 foods that they were previously tolerating back in, they feel horrible. They have like a massive setback, a flare up. And once you get to the point where you're just purely on carnivore and you've lost even those 15 to 20 foods that already felt very restrictive, at that point, adding dietary diversity is so much harder. I've done this with dozens of people, both in the 15 to 20 food range and then increasing back up to 100 plus foods, and also trying to go from carnivore just back up to the 15, 20 foods. And if you're in the 15 to 20 food range and you've been thinking about trying carnivore, please don't do it. It makes it so much harder to achieve long-term results, to change the composition of the microbiome in a favorable way. And if you're already at the point where you're on the carnivore diet, I do hope that what I'm explaining here, this situation, doesn't happen to you. I hope that you are able to reintroduce foods and it isn't difficult. But I just have quite a lot of experience showing me that that is how it tends to go. Next, we have the Candida diet. So the principle principle behind the Candida diet is we're just avoiding foods that feed Candida. So this would be generally your sugars and especially your highly refined sugars. So this is generally eating quite clean, and this is such a broad diet. There are a lot of different opinions. Some people will say you shouldn't consume fruit. Some people will say you shouldn't be consuming starches. Even though starch isn't sweet, it is made out of sugar. There's a lot of variations on this diet, but the underlying premise is that we're trying to avoid consuming foods that feed Candida. But this brings me back to the concept that we were talking about previously, and that is that the foods that you eat are only going to feed a dysbiotic microbiome if they're foods that you can't digest. So if you eat a banana and you feel completely fine, you should not restrict bananas. However, if you have a banana and then after consuming it, you get massively bloated, you see a flare up of your skin problems, everything that was going well just completely goes wrong, you should avoid that food, because that's your body telling you, we can't do this right now. But again, it's not a long-term solution. Fruit is healthy. Carbohydrates are healthy. It's possible to get back to a point where you are consuming all of these foods and they're healthful for you. But foods are not healthful for you if you can't digest them. I've found in my experience, it really is impossible to starve a dysbiosis. So if the idea behind doing a Candida diet is that you're going to starve Candida and eventually Candida is all going to die off and there's not going to be any more Candida left, I find that that's just a very reductionist understanding, and it just tends not to work. Anytime you have a dysbiosis present, you have to ask the question, how is this dysbiosis an adaptive response? One of the common things that I see with Candida is one of two things. The first is blood sugar dysregulation, and in this case, avoiding lots of highly processed refined foods that are high in sugar actually is very helpful. Not because it's starving Candida, but because it's giving your body the opportunity to regulate its blood sugars again. So it's funny how the solution potentially is actually correct, but it's completely by the wrong mechanism. And the second is that there is an accumulation of metal-based toxicity. So Candida is really common for people that have amalgam fillings or they have mercury toxicity. That is probably the most common cause that I see for people having chronic Candida issues. Also, it can be as a consequence of being exposed to mold. So molds produce mycotoxins, which are antibiotic. They disrupt the healthy beneficial bacterial flora, which allows potentially pathogenic yeast organisms like Candida to grow. But again, starving it isn't going to solve it, and killing it also isn't going to solve it. We have to address the microbiome holistically. We have to support the body in rebalancing that microflora so that it can reach a new composition. And generally, just starving and killing doesn't tend to work. Tell me, how are you finding this video so far? Have I covered your diet yet? We've actually got 3 diets left on this list, so I'd be really interested to hear, have I covered yours yet? And if not, do you think I'm going to cover it in the next 3? Next on the list, we have the gluten-free, dairy-free. Now, this is really common, especially in circles around, let's say, autism. This tends to be quite common. And this is because there are very frequently some noticeable results, especially in the United States. So gluten and dairy tend to be problematic for a couple of reasons. First of all, the food supply has changed a lot, especially in the United States. Gluten and dairy over there are not the same as gluten and dairy in Europe, in the United Kingdom, or in Italy, for example. In fact, I have dozens of clients that cannot eat gluten and dairy in the United States. They come to Europe and they feel great. They can eat bread and they're losing weight and their gut feels amazing. So that is a really important distinction, first of all. But the reason that this diet is used is gluten and dairy, especially when your digestive system is off, can be a bit hard to digest. And when these things aren't digested correctly, they can produce molecules that actually to the body look like opiates, and they can become very addictive. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. When you look at almost every culture on earth, they always have some food that is gluten-based covered with something dairy. So you can look at the pasta and cheese combination. You can look at the pizza with cheese on top. Wherever you go, the combination of gluten and dairy is really, really common. And that could be because if it isn't digested correctly, it gives you these opiate-like substances that feel really good and can be really addictive. But again, as with some of the other diets that we've talked about, this isn't solving anything. If these foods are causing inflammation in the gut, that can be really helpful, but it's not really fixing the cause of the problem. So I would say you could consider this diet to be symptom relief at best. Next on this list, we have plant-based. And if you watched any of my other videos, you know this is probably going to be a funny one for us to talk about. So I'll be the first to say I'm not a fan of plant-based diets. I think if you really do your research and you look into nutrient density, bioavailability of foods, ancestral diets, you'll come to see that animal foods are wonderfully nourishing and fulfill a role in the diet that plant foods can't. However, I do think that there is an opportunity for plant-based diets to be used correctly and healthfully, and that would be to use them over a prolonged detox or cleanse. So if you are somebody that knows that your gut dysbiosis presentation is being perpetuated by chronic toxicity, doing something like a vegan diet or a juice cleanse or something for a somewhat prolonged period of time, let's say 2 to 6 weeks, then a plant-based diet could potentially be very, very helpful. Plants are very cleansing. They provide a lot of cleansing cleansing and detoxifying substances to the body. So if we use these for, let's say, an appropriate time period, we don't want to create a state of depletion in your body. And as plant foods tend to be more cleansing and detoxing versus nourishing, which I see comes more from the animal food side of things, you would really want to make sure that you're in a nourished state first and you feel that your body is really asking for a cleanse or a detox. Then I would look at using a plant-based diet to support the body in the cleansing and detoxification process. And I would have an emphasis on foods that are very high in enzymes. So doing a plant-based diet, I'm not thinking so much like let's have a bunch of rice and potatoes. What I'm really thinking is let's get a bunch of fresh vegetable juice in here. Let's eat a bunch of sprouts. Let's sprout our nuts and seeds. Let's do broccoli sprouts, alfalfa sprouts. We want lots of high enzyme, high phytonutrient, very cleaning and cleansing and detoxifying substances. And there's no reason you can't include all of these things in a nourishing diet. For example, all of those things that I discussed are principles that are used in nourishing diets like the GAPS diet. My favorite way to actually incorporate more of this cleansing and detoxification in a more nourishing animal-based diet would be to incorporate weekly or bi-weekly fasts. So not consuming any significant caloric intake for 24, 36, 48 hours. And during this time, I would also consider using things like juices, fresh vegetable juices, to actually support in that detoxification and cleansing process. And finally, on this list, we have the Weston A-Price diet. There are many common themes between the Weston A-Price diet and diets like the GAPS diet, the Autoimmune Paleo diet. But one of the key distinctions that I really feel on the Weston A-Price diet is this concept of hypernourishment, really encouraging and prioritizing high nutrient dense foods. One of the major premises is that ancestral cultures didn't really tend to have cavities. They had very good dental health overall. And that is believed that this is a consequence of the very high level of nourishment that they received from their diet. A heavy emphasis on animal foods, meat, stock, bone broth, organ meats, liver, and also a lot of a reduction in things like grains, eating very, very clean, and kind of following that autoimmune paleo kind of principle. As I mentioned earlier, I really like the GAPS diet and would put it towards the top of the list. I would say the GAPS diet is a really nice diet to be on while you're working on actually actively healing the gut. But then the Weston A-Price diet tends to be a bit more of a sort of a natural transition to more of a sustainable long-term diet. Now, I've actually got one bonus for you here. And this bonus point is a concept called intuitive eating. So whatever gut health diet that you go with, whatever on this list you like the sounds of and that you choose, I want you to bring some of this intuitive eating to it. So the idea behind intuitive eating is that your body has an intelligence and your appetite is like a form of biofeedback. Your body is communicating to you with your appetite, with the foods that you feel like your body is asking you to consume. And we can use this biofeedback to help us consume foods that are actually healing for us. And I think this is quite underrated, because if you were to consider how much money is spent on functional testing, on stool tests, on blood tests, on all these different things, or even on smart technology like Garmin or the Oura Ring, or different things that provide you with heart rate variability and these different forms of biofeedback, we're actually getting biofeedback from our body all of the time. It's telling us with how we feel, it's telling us with symptoms, it's telling us with things like our appetite. All of this is biofeedback, is very useful information. So what I'm encouraging you to do, what I'm inviting you to do today is whatever you choose from this list, or if it's something else entirely, and if I missed anything, do be sure to let me know. But whatever it is that you're doing, try to follow that little whisper of intuition. Try to follow that little hint of biofeedback that your body is giving you with your appetite. If you're doing the GAPS diet and it says you have to drink 3 cups of broth every single day, and you've been doing that for 4 weeks and your body's saying, I don't want that anymore, I want fresh juices, then do that. If you're doing the carnivore diet and all you've been eating is beef for the last 6 months and your body's saying, I'm craving some fish, give it a try. Whatever it is and however it works for you, however it fits into what's going on with the way that you're eating right now, I encourage you to explore that little intuitive nudge that your body is pushing you towards. Because one of the things I've learned more than anything, especially in the process of healing my gut and that of hundreds of other people, is that sometimes what we think is healing with our heads is actually not healing for our body. The body knows what healing is. The body is what is going to do all of the healing work. So if we can learn to bring ourselves back to our bodies, listen to the communications that our body is giving us, and use that to help guide us in our approach, we can get that connection between the mind and the body. And find what true healing actually is. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about any of the diets that I've talked about, or if there's any that I've missed that you have questions about, please leave me a comment below. If you've stuck it all the way to the end, I cannot believe your dedication to healing. The attention span of the average person nowadays is like 5 seconds, is 0. In fact, and you will not believe this, more than 60% of people that click on one of my videos click off within the first 40 seconds. So if you've watched it all the way through to the end, you are amazing. You have a good attention span. You're clearly very engaged. And I would ask you to leave me a comment below with 3 purple hearts. This is a secret code so that I know you watched the video all the way to the end. So that's everything from me. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.